In the deep quiet of the house, with rain whispering against the window pane, the world was reduced to just this room, this bed. The only light was a pale silver glow from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows that danced with their movements. His breath was ragged, lost in the scent of her hair spread across the pillow. Every touch felt both intimately familiar and dangerously new, a paradox that fueled the fire in his veins. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, his voice thick with a pleasure that was almost painful. "Clara, oh God, Clara, you feel different." The words were a confession, an observation he couldn't hold back. For a moment, the body beneath him simply arched, a silent, shuddering response. A low moan escaped her throat, a sound deeper and more unrestrained than he was used to. Then, after a pause that felt like an eternity, she shifted, her lips finding his ear, her breath hot and intoxicating. "Different how, baby?" The question was a ghost of a whisper, laced with a playful, forbidden knowledge that sent a jolt through him. A flicker of wrongness, of a boundary crossed, tried to surface in his mind, but it was instantly drowned by the overwhelming tide of sensation, a pleasure so sharp and consuming it erased everything else. That moment, however, was not the beginning. It was the chaotic, inevitable conclusion to a story that had started just 2 weeks before, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Back then, my life with Clara was a masterpiece of comfortable predictability. We lived in a quiet suburb of Portland, where the persistent drizzle seemed to wash the color from the world, leaving behind a gentle, muted gray that matched the rhythm of our lives. Ours was a love that had settled, like fine dust, on every surface of our shared existence. It was in the familiar weight of her body next to mine in bed, the automatic way I'd pour her coffee in the morning, the soft, dutiful kiss we exchanged before I left for my architecture firm. She was my anchor, the steady, reliable center of my world. But anchors, by their very nature, do not move. The passion that had once defined us had softened into a quiet affection, a partnership built on routine and shared history rather than unpredictable desire. We were happy, or so I told myself. We were safe. Then, the phone rang. It was Amelia, Clara's twin sister, calling from New York. I could hear the crackle of energy in her voice, even through the phone, a stark contrast to my wife's placid tones. There had been another breakup, another stormy end to a passionate affair, and she needed a place to land, to breathe, just for a little while. Clara, ever the caretaker, agreed immediately. To me, it was a minor disruption, a temporary ripple. She was family, after all, a mirror image of my wife who would stay in the guest room for a few weeks. I had no idea that I wasn't welcoming a guest into our home. I was letting in a storm, one that would not just disturb the waters, but shatter the very foundation of the life I thought I knew. She arrived on a day when the sky was a blanket of uninterrupted gray, a fine mist hanging in the air that wasn't quite rain but dampened everything it touched. I was working from my home office, watching the taxi pull up to the curb, and for a disorienting moment, my brain registered that Clara was home early. The figure that emerged, however, shattered that illusion instantly. It was Clara's form, her height, her silhouette, but it was dressed in an entirely different language. She wore fitted black jeans that hugged her legs and hips in a way Clara's practical trousers never would, and a worn leather jacket that seemed to carry the scent of a city far bigger and faster than ours. She pulled a suitcase from the trunk with an effortless, almost masculine grace, and as she looked toward the house, her dark hair, unbound and wilder than I'd ever seen Clara's, was tossed by a sudden breeze. It was like watching a familiar photograph suddenly animate in a completely unexpected way. The first evening was a surreal performance of echoes. Having the two of them in the same room, sitting across from each other at our dining table, was profoundly unsettling. It was like my vision was blurred, like I was seeing double, yet every detail was sharp and distinct. Their voices were the most jarring part. They possessed the same timbre, the same melodic pitch, but they used them so differently. Clara's words were measured, flowing in a calm, gentle stream. Amelia, on the other hand, spoke in vibrant bursts of energy. Her sentences were punctuated with quick, throaty laughter and the constant, expressive movement of her hands. She would lean forward when telling a story about her chaotic life in New York, her eyes wide, drawing you into her world, while Clara would listen with a placid, gentle smile, her hands resting calmly in her lap. I found myself caught in the conversational crossfire, my head turning from one to the other, feeling like a spectator at a strange, beautiful tennis match where the players were identical. My eyes, however, kept betraying me, drifting back to Amelia, cataloging the differences with an almost obsessive focus. I told myself it was simple curiosity, a scientific fascination with the minute variations between two genetically identical people, but it was more than that. It was a pull, a magnetic force I couldn't rationalize. Clara had her dark hair pulled back into the neat, elegant bun she always wore, a few soft tendrils escaping to frame her face. It was beautiful, controlled, familiar. Amelia's hair was a living thing, a cascade of dark waves that fell over her shoulders and onto her back. Throughout the evening, she developed a habit, a nervous tic perhaps, of reaching up and hooking a stray strand behind her ear, her fingers brushing against her temple. It was a simple, unconscious gesture, yet every time she did it, my gaze followed her hand, noticed the delicate curve of her ear, the line of her jaw. It was an act of casual, unstudied allure that felt more potent than any overt seduction. She wore a simple, dark red sweater, nothing provocative, but it clung to her frame differently than Clara's clothes did. Where Clara's style was about comfort and modesty, Amelia's seemed to be an unconscious celebration of her own form. The soft fabric draped over the full curve of her breasts, tucked into the narrowest part of her waist, and stretched taut over the swell of her hips where they met her jeans. It was the same body I had known for years, the same vessel of my wife's spirit, yet it was presented to the world with an entirely different energy. It was a body that seemed comfortable with being looked at, a body that hummed with a restless, kinetic confidence. I found my eyes tracing the lines of her figure, and each time I would catch myself, a hot flush of guilt creeping up my neck. I would force myself to look at Clara, to focus on my wife, the rightful object of my affection. I'd smile at her, ask her a question, anything to break the spell Amelia was inadvertently casting. But the most potent difference was in their faces. Looking from one to the other was a lesson in how the soul shapes the clay. They had the same high cheekbones, the same delicate nose, the same perfectly shaped mouth, but the life lived behind those features had carved different expressions into them. Clara's face was serene. Her beauty was a calm harbor, a place of peace. Her smile was soft, gentle, and utterly sincere. Amelia's face was a landscape of storms. When she smiled, it was a wider, more dangerous thing, a flash of white teeth that hinted at a life lived with more recklessness. The lipstick she wore, a deep, velvety red, made her lips seem fuller, bolder, a stark contrast to Clara's natural, pale mouth. They looked like they were made for different purposes. Clara's for soft pecks of affection, Amelia's for deep, consuming kisses. And then there were her eyes. They were the same shade of deep brown as my wife's, but they held a completely different light. Clara's gaze was loving, accepting, comfortable. It was a gaze that knew me completely and forgave all my flaws. When Amelia looked at me, her eyes held a direct, unnerving intensity. She didn't just look at you, she seemed to look into you. A few times during dinner, our eyes met across the table, and she would hold my gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was polite, a tiny, almost imperceptible challenge in her expression. In that fleeting moment, I felt a jolt, a feeling of being truly seen, not as Clara's husband or as a familiar fixture in the house, but as a man. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I would quickly look away, my heart hammering against my ribs, telling myself I was imagining things, that it was all in my head. Any man would be intrigued by this bizarre situation. It was natural, it was innocent. But later that night, as I lay in the dark beside my sleeping wife, feeling the familiar warmth of her body, the image that burned behind my closed eyelids was not hers. It was the ghost of her face, animated by a different spirit. It was the flash of a reckless smile, the startling red of a knowing mouth, and the hypnotic, dangerous light in a pair of identical brown eyes. The first few days of Amelia's visit settled into a strange new rhythm, a delicate dance of three people in a space designed for two. On the surface, things were normal. We'd have breakfast together, Clara would go to her job at the local library, and I would retreat to my office. The sound of Amelia's soft movements around the house, a quiet, constant distraction. But beneath the placid surface of domesticity, an unspoken tension was beginning to build, a low hum of electricity in the air that seemed to center around her presence. I was acutely aware of her in a way that felt disloyal to my wife. I knew which chair she preferred in the living room, the one by the window that caught the afternoon light. I learned the sound of her specific footstep on the hardwood floor, lighter and quicker than Clara's. I was collecting these details, these insignificant pieces of her, and storing them away without understanding why. The moment it all changed, the instant that casual observation curdled into something much darker, happened on a Thursday night. A persistent heavy rain had been falling all day, sealing us inside the house, cocooned from the outside world. After a quiet dinner, Clara, who was prone to migraines brought on by the shifting barometric pressure, pressed her fingers to her temples and announced she was going to bed early. She kissed my cheek, a familiar, comforting gesture, and then kissed her sister's, before disappearing up the stairs, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more significant than before. The room was suddenly charged with possibility. It was just the two of us, surrounded by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof and the low glow of a single lamp. We sat for a while, the silence stretching between us, not awkwardly, but with a certain weight. Amelia was curled on the armchair, a glass of red wine cradled in her hands. To fill the quiet, I asked her about New York, but she just shrugged, a flicker of something sad in her eyes. Then she turned the conversation, her gaze sharp and direct. "What about you, Ethan? Are you happy?" The question was so blunt, so unexpected, it caught me off guard. Of course, I answered automatically, a husband's conditioned response. She smiled, a knowing, slightly crooked smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's not what I asked. I didn't ask if you have a good life. I asked if you're happy." No one had asked me that in years. Not even Clara. Our conversations revolved around renovations, bills, vacation plans, the logistics of a shared life. Amelia was asking about my soul, and for some reason, I felt compelled to answer honestly. I talked. I spoke about my work, how the passion for creating beautiful, meaningful spaces had slowly been eroded by client budgets and building codes, until most days it just felt like drawing lines on a screen. I talked about the dreams I once had of designing buildings that would take people's breath away, and how that dream had shrunk into designing functional, profitable suburban homes. I confessed a sense of stagnation, a feeling that my life had hit a plateau, a beautiful, comfortable, and utterly flat plateau. I was saying things to her I hadn't even fully admitted to myself, and she listened. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes. She just watched me, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight, and nodded, making me feel as if the things I was saying were the most important words in the world. An intimacy was growing between us, woven from words and shared vulnerabilities that felt more dangerous than any physical touch. It was in the middle of this confession, as I was describing a particularly frustrating project, that I made a joke about my client's terrible taste. A genuine loud laugh escaped Amelia's lips, a sound so full of life it seemed to brighten the dim room. As she laughed, she threw her head back, gesturing with the hand that held her wine glass. The movement was too sharp. Dark red liquid sloshed over the rim, cascading down the front of her simple white t-shirt. "Oh God," she gasped, the laughter dying in her throat as she looked down at the large, spreading stain. "Damn it, I'm so clumsy." She jumped to her feet and I stood up with her, my mind immediately shifting to practicalities, soda water, a cloth. But then I looked at her, truly looked at her, and the world seemed to slow down. The cheap cotton of her shirt, now soaked with the dark wine, had become completely transparent. It clung to her skin like a second, weeping membrane. And underneath, starkly visible, was the most intricate, delicate black lace bra I had ever seen. It wasn't a practical, comfortable piece of lingerie like the ones Clara wore. This was different. It was a web of black, patterned lace with a scalloped edge that traced the upper swell of her breasts. It framed the pale, full curves of her flesh, the dark areolae faintly visible through the sheer fabric. My breath caught in my throat. My mind went completely blank. All I could see was the shocking contrast. The pristine white of the shirt, the bloody red of the wine, the funereal black of the lace, and the soft, vulnerable pallor of her skin. It was a transgressive work of art created by accident. She looked down at herself, then back up at me. She saw where my eyes were fixed. A flush crept up her neck, a genuine blush of embarrassment, but her eyes held something else. There was no panic, no rush to cover herself. She just stood there for 1, 2, 3 seconds, caught in the beam of my gaze. It was a moment of pure, silent communication. A moment where she knew that I saw her, not as my wife's sister, but as a woman, and in that moment, she did not look away. "Oops," she finally whispered, her voice a little husky. I guess that's one way to ruin a shirt. My own voice felt trapped in my chest. I finally managed to croak out something about getting a towel, and I turned and almost ran to the kitchen, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. When I came back with a damp cloth, she was gone, presumably upstairs to change. I was left alone in the quiet room, the scent of spilled wine hanging in the air. I looked at the dark red stain on the beige carpet, a blemish on our perfect, ordered home. But it was nothing compared to the image that was now permanently seared onto the back of my eyelids. The seed of fascination, of quiet curiosity, had been watered with wine, and in the dark, fertile soil of my unfulfilled desires, it had just broken ground and begun to grow into something monstrous. Clara was scheduled to attend a regional librarians' conference in Seattle, 3 days and 2 nights. When she told me, my first reaction was a simple, uncomplicated sense of missing her already. But as the day of her departure approached, another, more complex feeling began to surface, a low thrum of nervous anticipation I refused to name. The morning she left, our goodbye was routine. I kissed her, my lips brushing against the familiar soft skin of her cheek, told her to be safe, and watched her drive away until her car was just a speck in the rearview mirror of my mind. When I closed the front door, the silence that greeted me was profound. The house, which had felt charged and crowded for a week, now seemed cavernously empty, a vacuum that amplified every tiny sound. The only other presence was Amelia, and suddenly, her being there felt less like a comfort and more like a dare. That first night was a masterclass in avoidance. We moved around each other like celestial bodies held in a careful, distant orbit by a force we both understood, but would never acknowledge. We made small talk about the weather, about a movie she had seen, about my work. The conversation was a thin, brittle sheet of ice over a deep, dark body of water. We ate dinner with a formal politeness that was entirely foreign to our home, the clinking of our forks against the plates seeming unnervously loud in the quiet dining room. We were both acutely aware of Clara's empty chair, a silent, judging ghost at the table. After cleaning the kitchen in near total silence, we mumbled our goodnights and retreated to our separate ends of the house before 9 o'clock. I lay in my bed, in the sprawling emptiness of the space I usually shared with my wife, and I could hear the faint sound of Amelia's television through the wall. I was trying, with every fiber of my being, to be a good man, a faithful husband. I was trying to honor the trust Clara had placed in me. But the awareness of Amelia, just a few yards away, was a physical presence in the room, a warmth I could feel against my skin. The second day, the atmosphere began to shift. The forced politeness of the night before had been exhausting, and a kind of weary truce settled over us. We talked more easily, the ice between us beginning to thaw, and then the storm rolled in. It started in the late afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The wind began to howl, and the rain came down not as a drizzle, but as a hard, percussive assault against the windows and roof. It was a proper Portland storm, the kind that makes you feel grateful for shelter, the kind that seals you off from the rest of the world. It was a perfect excuse to build a fire, to open another bottle of wine, to settle in, and as darkness fell, the storm's intensity grew, the wind shrieking like a living thing. Then, with a sudden, violent flicker, the lights went out, plunging the house into a thick, disorienting blackness. For a moment, we were both completely still, suspended in the dark. Well, Amelia's voice came from across the room, closer than I expected. This is dramatic. I could hear the smile in her voice. The power outage broke the last of the tension. It turned us into a team, a pair of co-conspirators against the dark. We fumbled around, laughing as we bumped into furniture, our hands brushing against each other in the search for candles. We found a stash in the kitchen drawer and soon had a small constellation of them lit on the coffee table, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The world outside, with its howling wind and lashing rain, was gone. Our world had shrunk to this small circle of warm, flickering light. The effect was hypnotic, magical. It felt like a confessional. In the soft, forgiving glow, we talked for hours. The conversation was different now, more hushed, more intimate. It felt as if the darkness had given us permission to shed our prescribed roles. At some point, she shivered, rubbing her arms. "It's getting cold," she said, her voice soft. "I should probably go change into something warmer." She stood up, her form a graceful silhouette against the firelight. I watched her leave the room, expecting her to turn towards the guest bedroom. But she didn't. She turned the other way, her footsteps moving softly down the hall towards the master bedroom, towards my room, Clara's room. I sat there, frozen, every muscle in my body tensed. I didn't breathe. I just listened. I heard the soft click of our bedroom door opening. A few moments later, I heard the faint sound of a drawer sliding open, the one where Clara kept her nightgowns. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Then I heard another sound, the delicate, glassy clink of a perfume bottle being lifted from a tray. A moment later, a scent reached me, carried on the still air of the house. It was Clara's perfume, a light, floral scent of jasmine and white lily that I had smelled 1,000 times. But this was different. It was her scent, but it was on another person's skin, mingling with Amelia's unique chemistry, creating a hybrid fragrance that was both achingly familiar and dizzyingly new. It was the scent of my wife, weaponized. Then, she appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, a pale figure framed by the deeper darkness of the hall, letting my eyes adjust. As she stepped slowly into the candlelight, the breath I was holding escaped me in a silent rush. She was wearing one of Clara's favorite nightgowns, a simple chemise made of pale silver silk. On Clara, it was elegant, comfortable, almost chaste. On Amelia, the same thin sheath of silk was transformed. It clung to the fuller curve of her hips. It draped more revealingly over her breasts. It seemed to shimmer and flow with a life of its own as she moved. She had taken her hair down from the loose knot she'd had it in, and it cascaded over her bare shoulders, dark and wild in the flickering light. It was an illusion so perfect, so complete, it stole the air from my lungs. It was my wife's face, my wife's body, my wife's clothes, my wife's scent. But the eyes that met mine across the room were not my wife's. They held a spark of daring, a glint of thrilling, terrible knowledge. She walked towards me, her bare feet silent on the rug, the silk whispering around her legs. She didn't stop until she was standing right in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I could only look up at her, trapped, mesmerized by this impossible, beautiful mirage. She leaned down slightly, her face close to mine, her scent enveloping me. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a breath of sound, a seductive secret meant only for me. "Do I look like her now, Ethan?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unbreakable. It was not a question about appearance. It was an invitation. It was permission. A roaring began in my ears, the sound of my own blood, the shriek of every moral fiber in my body tearing apart. This was wrong, a sacrilege, a betrayal so profound it had no name. But as I looked at her, at this perfect, intoxicating fusion of the familiar and the forbidden, the voice of reason was just a whisper, and the voice of desire was a deafening, undeniable roar. My world narrowed to the space between us, to the warm, flickering candlelight dancing in her eyes. Her question, "Do I look like her now, Ethan?" was a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed inside me. My throat was dry, my mind a maelstrom of panic and a desire so profound it felt like a physical ache. Every instinct for self-preservation, for the preservation of my marriage, of the good, quiet life I had built with Clara, screamed at me to pull back, to end this madness. My lips parted, and her name, her real name, was the first word to escape, a last-ditch effort by the rational man I used to be. Amelia. I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. We can't do this. This island. It's insane. I was pleading with her, but I was also pleading with myself. She didn't argue. She didn't try to reason with me. She simply smiled, a slow, sad, beautiful smile, and lifted a hand to my face. She placed a single, soft finger against my lips, silencing my protest before it could gain any more strength. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a velvet caress in the quiet room. Her eyes held mine, and in their dark depths, I saw not malice, but a shared, lonely, wanting, "Don't think." "Not tonight." "Tonight," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial breath of sound. "Just for tonight. I'm her. Just call me Clara." It was the most absurd, the most wonderful, the most damning lie I had ever heard. It was an alibi for my heart, a permission slip for my soul. She was offering me a fantasy so perfect, so complete, that it felt less like a betrayal and more like a twisted kind of fidelity. She wasn't asking me to cheat on my wife. She was asking me to experience my wife in a way I had only ever dreamed of. The war inside me ended. Desire won a swift and total victory. My own hand, trembling slightly, rose to meet hers. I took her hand from my lips and laced my fingers with hers. Then I leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that bore no resemblance to the gentle, affectionate kisses I shared with Clara. This was a collision. It was frantic, hungry, a desperate attempt to close a gap that had been widening inside me for years. The taste of red wine and something uniquely her, something wild and electric, filled my senses. She didn't just receive the kiss. She met it, answered it, her mouth opening against mine, her other hand coming up to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer with a strength that surprised me. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of two people finding a temporary, reckless solace in each other. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, looking at her face, her lips swollen from my kiss, her eyes dark with a desire that mirrored my own. I knew that this could not end here. The living room, with its ghosts of family dinners and quiet evenings, felt wrong. Without a word, I broke our gaze, bent down, and slid one arm under her back and the other beneath her knees, lifting her into my arms. She was light, her body molding against mine, her arms wrapping around my neck as she buried her face in the crook of my shoulder. The journey from the living room to the bedroom was a dreamlike sequence, a blur of motion and sensation. The soft, whispering slide of the silk nightgown against my shirt, the scent of Clara's perfume radiating from Amelia's warm skin, the feeling of her heart beating a frantic rhythm against my own. I carried her into the sanctuary of my marriage, into the room I shared with her sister, and laid her gently on the bed. The storm outside had softened, and a sliver of moonlight now cut through a break in the clouds, illuminating her form on our bedsheets. For a moment, I just looked at her, this impossible creature of fantasy and reality. Then I moved over her, and the world outside the bed ceased to exist. I pushed the thin silk straps of the nightgown off her shoulders, letting the fabric pool around her waist. Her skin was pale and luminous in the moonlight, and as my hands and mouth explored her, I discovered that even her body, identical in form to my wife's, felt different. Her skin seemed softer, her responses more immediate, more electric. Where Clara's pleasure was a quiet, gentle hum, Amelia's was an audible, rising song. Her soft gasps turned into low moans that she didn't try to stifle. They were sounds of pure, uninhibited release, sounds this room had never heard before. As I moved, her hands weren't passive. They explored my back, her nails tracing light, desperate patterns on my skin, urging me on, pulling me deeper into her. The line between reality and the game she had initiated was gone. My mind, my body, they accepted the premise completely. I leaned down, my lips close to her ear, the name falling from my lips in a ragged, worshipful whisper. "Oh, Clara, God, you feel so tight." I wasn't just saying it, I believed it. In this moment, she was Clara, a wild, passionate, uninhibited version of her that I was finally allowed to touch. She arched against me, her head thrown back, a single, perfect tear tracing a path from the corner of her eye down to her temple. "Take me, Ethan," she breathed, her voice breaking on my name. "Take all of me." Every hesitant protest that had lingered in the back of my mind, the whispered, half-formed thoughts of Amelia, "Stop," had long since been burned away by the rising heat between us. All that was left was the rhythm of our bodies, a frantic, desperate dance that was both a discovery and a homecoming. The sounds in the room were no longer words, but the raw, guttural expressions of a pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. It was a release of every unspoken frustration, every quiet longing, every drop of tension that had been building since the moment she had first stepped out of that taxi. And as the world dissolved into a blinding white flash of sensation, there was no thought of right or wrong, no memory of Clara, no thought of Amelia. There was only this all-consuming, world-ending, beautiful oblivion. I woke first. The storm had broken, and the morning sun, a rare and brilliant thing in a Portland autumn, was slicing through the gap in the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The light was cruel. It was an interrogator, bright and merciless, exposing the squalor of the night's transgressions. The room was a disaster zone of discarded emotions. Clara's silk nightgown lay in a pale, crumpled heap on the floor, a fallen flag of surrender. An empty wine glass sat precariously on the nightstand next to our wedding photo. Clara and I, smiling, impossibly young and innocent, frozen in a moment before this new, ugly reality had been conceived. The air was thick and heavy with the stale scent of burnt-out candles, wine, and the undeniable animal musk of sex. It was the smell of the scene of the crime. Then, I turned my head on the pillow and looked at her. In the soft, forgiving shadows of the night, she had been a fantasy, a seductive specter wearing my wife's face. But in the stark, unforgiving light of day, the illusion was shattered. She was simply Amelia. Asleep, her features were relaxed, her expression peaceful, and the resemblance to Clara was so absolute, so perfect, it was like a physical blow to my gut. This was not some mythical, passionate creature. This was my wife's twin sister, lying naked in our bed. The full weight of what I had done crashed down on me, a tidal wave of guilt so powerful it left me breathless. I was a cliché, the faithless husband, a cheap, sordid character in a story as old as time. I thought of Clara in her sterile Seattle hotel room, probably waking up and thinking of me, of our home, of the life she trusted me to protect. A wave of self-loathing washed over me, so intense it made me feel nauseous. I was disgusting. I had taken something pure and defiled it, not just with a stranger, but with a living, breathing mirror of the one person I was supposed to cherish above all others. And yet, even as the guilt was clawing at my insides, my treacherous mind began to betray me. It started replaying the night, not as a confession of sin, but as a highlight reel of forbidden pleasures. Like in phantom limb, I could still feel the shocking sensation of her nails, not sharp and angry, but desperate and electric, tracing paths across my back. The memory of her sounds echoed in my ears, the unrestrained, throaty moans of pleasure that she had not tried to suppress, sounds of pure abandon that I had never heard from Clara's lips. My mind, the traitor, conjured the image of her from the night before the storm, when the wine had stained her shirt. It superimposed that memory onto the one from last night, imagining the delicate web-like pattern of black lace she must have been wearing beneath Clara's innocent silken nightgown. It was a potent, perverse combination, the sacred and the profane, the wife and the whore, all wrapped up in one perfect, impossible body. My gaze drifted down her sleeping form, over the curve of her shoulder, the gentle slope of her back, down to the full, perfect curve of her buttocks, partially covered by the tangled sheet. I remembered how she felt, the way she had arched against me, the sheer, unadulterated physicality of her passion. And then the most horrifying, unforgivable truth of all landed in my gut like a stone. It had been the most intensely alive I had felt in years. The sex had not just been good, it had been revelatory. It was a different language of intimacy, a language of raw, selfish, desperate need that I hadn't spoken in so long I'd forgotten it even existed. I hadn't just committed an act of infidelity. I had discovered a preference. The thought was so vile, so monstrous, that I had to physically close my eyes, as if to block it out, but it was too late. The knowledge was there now, a poison that had already seeped into my bloodstream. The rustle of sheets broke my self-flagellating trance. Amelia was waking up. I watched her, my body tensed, holding my breath. I needed to see her reaction. I was desperate for it, praying for tears, for shame, for a shared sense of regret that would somehow validate my own. She stretched, a long, cat-like movement, and then her eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with sleep for a moment, then they focused on the ceiling. Then, slowly, they turned and found mine. There was no gasp of horror, no immediate flush of shame. She simply looked at me, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes holding mine in the quiet room. The silence stretched for an eternity, filled with everything that had happened between us. I was the one who broke it, my voice a dry, scratchy thing. "Amelia," I said, the sound of her name in this bed feeling like another betrayal. "About last night." She didn't let me finish. She didn't give me the satisfaction of a confession or the relief of an absolution. She just kept looking at me, her head tilted slightly. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips, a smile that was not happy but knowing. It was terrifying. "What about it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice low and husky with sleep. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a question, it was a statement. It was a mirror, reflecting the choice, the desire, the guilt right back at me. She pushed herself up slightly, the sheet falling to her waist, revealing the soft, pale skin of her breasts in the morning light. She seemed completely unashamed of her nudity, of the situation. "We're both adults," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We knew what we were doing." And with that, she denied me my escape. I couldn't paint her as the villain, the ruthless seductress who had led me astray. Her words made us equals, co-conspirators in this beautiful, ugly mess. She swung her legs out of bed, wrapping the sheet around her body with a fluid, graceful movement, and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me alone in the wreckage. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress still holding the warmth of her body, my head in my hands. The morning had come, but it had brought no clarity. It had only brought the cold, hard certainty of two facts. The first was that I had just irrevocably broken my marriage and shattered the man I thought I was. The second, and far more terrifying, was that if she were to walk back into this room and offer me that same forbidden fruit again, I would devour it without a moment's hesitation. The addiction had already taken hold. The sound of her car pulling into the driveway was a sound I had heard 1,000 times, a familiar, comforting signal that my day was ending and my evening with my wife was beginning. But on that Sunday afternoon, it sounded like a siren. My heart seized in my chest, a jolt of pure animal panic. I looked at Amelia, who was sitting across the living room from me, pretending to read a book. Her eyes met mine over the top of the pages, and in that shared glance, a silent, frantic agreement was made. The next 2 minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. We moved through the house like seasoned criminals, erasing evidence, our actions swift and silent. I snatched the 2 wine glasses from last night off the coffee table, rinsing them and placing them back in the cupboard. She plumped the cushions on the armchair where she had sat, as if to erase the very indentation of her body. We checked the bedroom, smoothing the duvet, ensuring no trace of her presence lingered in my marital bed. It was a frantic, silent dance of conspiracy, a shared act of scrubbing our sin from the very air of the house. When the front door opened, we were both back in the living room, perfectly positioned, the very picture of domestic tranquility. Clara stepped inside, dropping her bags, her face bright with the joy of returning home. "I'm back," she called out, her voice a cheerful, innocent sound that felt like a physical blow. She was oblivious, a traveler returning to her homeland, unaware that a quiet, devastating civil war had been fought and lost in her absence. I went to her, wrapping her in a hug, burying my face in her hair. It smelled of her familiar shampoo, not the jasmine perfume Amelia had worn. As I held my wife, I could feel Amelia's eyes on my back. The hug, an act that should have been one of reunion and relief, felt like a performance, a lie I was telling with my body. Clara felt smaller in my arms, softer, less solid than the woman I had held 2 nights before. The comparison was instantaneous, involuntary, and sickening. Life snapped back to its familiar shape, but it was a fragile, hollow facsimile of what it once was. On the surface, everything was normal. We were 3 people sharing a house. But underneath, every moment was fraught with a terrifying subtext. That first dinner back was a masterclass in deception. Clara, full of stories about her conference, chattered on, and I played the part of the dutiful, interested husband. I was a performer, and this was the role of a lifetime. I was overly attentive, asking follow-up questions, laughing a little too loudly, touching her hand across the table a little too often. All the while, my senses were on high alert, tracking Amelia's every micro-expression, every shift in her seat. I was living in a state of heightened paranoia, terrified that a single misplaced glance, a moment of shared eye contact between Amelia and me, would give the whole rotten game away. Amelia, for her part, was a far better actor than I. She was brilliant. She was warm, sisterly, asking Clara all the right questions, sharing a funny story about something she'd cooked while Clara was away. Her composure was my salvation and my torment. It made our secret feel both safer and infinitely more sinister. At one point, Clara looked between us, a happy, guileless smile on her face. "I'm so glad you two got along while I was gone," she said. "I was hoping you would." My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel a sweat break out on my forehead. I mumbled something noncommittal, but Amelia just laughed, a light, easy sound. "Of course we did," she said, reaching over to squeeze her sister's arm. Ethan was a perfect gentleman. The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it made my blood run cold. The days that followed were a quiet, sustained form of psychological torture. I had become an obsessive critic of my own life, and I was constantly comparing the two women who shared the same face. It was a poison that seeped into everything, tainting every interaction. I started noticing things about Clara, little habits and quirks that I had once found endearing, that now grated on my nerves. The way she would hum slightly off-key while making coffee, the predictable way she would recount the plot of a television show she'd just watched. These were the gentle, comfortable rhythms of our life together, but now they felt mundane, irritatingly safe. My mind would immediately contrast them with memories of Amelia, her unpredictable wit, the way she would debate a point with a fiery passion, the deep, soul-bearing conversation we had shared in the candlelight. I was beginning to resent my wife for her predictability, for her placid nature, for not being the storm that her sister was. The ultimate betrayal, however, was not just in my mind. It became physical. A few nights after Clara returned, we were lying in bed. She rolled over and pressed herself against me, initiating intimacy with a familiar, sleepy gesture. In the past, I would have welcomed it, a quiet, comfortable connection at the end of the day. But now, it felt like a test. I agreed. I kissed her. I went through the motions. But as I did, I closed my eyes. And in the private theater of my mind, I began to direct a different scene. I consciously, deliberately, replaced my wife with her sister. I summoned the memory of Amelia's scent, that intoxicating mix of jasmine and her own unique musk. I imagined the feel of her hands on my back, her nails lightly scraping my skin. I pictured her face, her eyes dark with passion, her lips parted as she whispered my name. Fueled by this phantom, my own actions changed. I was more aggressive, more passionate, my movements more urgent than they had been with Clara in years. I was trying to recreate the feeling, the intensity, the fire I had felt with Amelia. I was no longer making love to my wife. I was using her body as a prop, a vessel for a desperate, depraved fantasy. And the most twisted part of it all was that she responded. She mistook my desperate, guilt-ridden lust for renewed passion for her. When it was over, she lay beside me, breathing heavily, and snuggled into my side. "Wow," she whispered into the darkness, a happy, satisfied smile in her voice. "Someone really missed me." The words, so innocent, so loving, were like a shard of glass in my gut. The guilt was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had just committed the most profound act of infidelity imaginable, not in another woman's bed, but in my own, with my own wife. I lay there in the dark for hours after she had fallen asleep, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I was a stranger in my own bed, a ghost in my own life, haunted by a woman who looked exactly like the one sleeping peacefully beside me. Living under the same roof with my desire and my duty, both wearing the same face, was a unique and exquisite form of torment. The house became a pressure cooker, and the air grew thick with unspoken things. We moved through our days in a state of constant, humming tension, a magnetic field of attraction and repulsion that left me perpetually on edge. It was in the small moments that the torture was most acute. My hand and Amelia's brushing against each other as we both reached for the milk in the fridge, a jolt of electricity that was both thrilling and horrifying. A shared look across the dinner table that lasted a fraction of a second too long, a silent conversation that made Clara look up from her plate and ask, "Is everything okay?" I was an addict, and my drug was a constant, tantalizing presence, always just out of reach. The memory of our night together was a relentless ghost that haunted my waking hours. At work, I would stare blankly at blueprints, my mind replaying every touch, every sound. At night, I would lie next to my wife, her gentle breathing a soft counterpoint to the raging storm of my secret longing. The fantasy of the first time, the game of pretending she was Clara, had evaporated. Now, my desire was sharp, specific, and aimed squarely at Amelia herself. I didn't want a different version of my wife anymore. I wanted her. The dam finally broke on a Saturday afternoon. The day was deceptively normal, bright and sunny. We were all in the living room, the television murmuring in the background, a perfect picture of domestic peace. Then Clara stood up, grabbing her car keys from the hook by the door. "I completely forgot we're out of milk for tomorrow morning," she announced to no one in particular, "and I wanted to grab that new book that came in at the library. I'll be back in half an hour tops." She kissed my cheek, a quick, casual peck, and with a cheerful, "Be right back," she was gone. The sound of her car starting, of the tires crunching on the gravel driveway as she pulled away, was a starting pistol. The moment the sound faded, the placid atmosphere in the house shattered. A profound, charged silence descended. It was just us. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to grow impossibly loud, each second a countdown. I didn't plan it. There was no conscious thought, no weighing of pros and cons. My body simply moved, compelled by a force that had become too powerful to resist. I turned my head and looked at Amelia, who was sitting on the armchair, her knees tucked beneath her. She was already looking at me, and in her eyes, I saw the same desperate, unbearable craving that was clawing its way up my own throat. There was no question, no seduction, no game. There was only a raw, mutual, and immediate need. I stood up and crossed the room in 3 long strides. I didn't say a word. I simply reached down, took her hand, and pulled her to her feet. The kiss was not like the first time, which had been a desperate discovery. This was a brutal, hungry claiming. I backed her against the wall, my mouth devouring hers, my hands tangling in her hair, pulling her head back. She responded with a ferocity that matched my own, her body pressing into mine, her hands gripping my shoulders. We weren't making love. We were trying to consume each other. The bedroom felt a million miles away. We were going to take each other here, now, in the heart of the home I shared with her sister, surrounded by our wedding photos and the comfortable, familiar furniture that suddenly seemed like mocking witnesses to our betrayal. We stumbled towards the sofa, a tangle of limbs and frantic motion. My hands went to her blouse, fumbling with the small, delicate buttons, my fingers thick and clumsy with haste. A growl of pure frustration escaped my throat, and I gave up on finesse. I simply gripped both sides of the fabric and pulled. The buttons popped, one of them flying across the room and hitting the floor with a tiny, sharp click. The sound was violent, final. The shirt fell open, and my breath hitched. She wore nothing underneath. Her breasts, full and round and pale, were completely bare, her nipples hard. The sight of her, so beautifully, shockingly exposed in the bright afternoon light, pushed me over the edge. We fell onto the sofa, a chaotic heap of raw desire. I was tearing at her jeans, she was unbuckling my belt, our movements hurried and rough. This was not the tender, deliberate lovemaking I shared with my wife. This was a frantic, almost violent collision, fueled by weeks of repression and the thrilling, terrifying knowledge that our time was limited. As I moved inside her, the reality of our situation, the sheer, insane risk of it, pierced through the haze of my lust. The front door was unlocked. Anyone could walk in. Clara could have forgotten something. I leaned down, my lips against her ear, my breathing ragged. "Amelia," I whispered, the use of her real name, a confirmation that this was no fantasy. Someone could see. She could be back any minute. I expected my words to cool her ardor, to bring a dose of reality. Instead, they seemed to fuel her. She locked her legs around my waist, pulling me impossibly deeper, her eyes squeezed shut in a state of pure, ecstatic concentration. "Ethan," she gasped, her voice a raw, demanding plea that set my soul on fire. "Harder, please, harder." Her words shattered my last shred of restraint. The fear didn't vanish. It transformed, twisting into a powerful, perverse aphrodisiac. The danger, the risk of being caught and having our lives utterly destroyed, became part of the pleasure. Every thrust was a gamble. Every sound from the street was a potential heartbreak. Our bodies moved in a frantic, desperate rhythm, a race against the ticking clock and our own crumbling morality. The sounds that filled the room were not the soft murmurs of love, but the harsh, breathless gasps of two people taking exactly what they needed, consequences be damned. The climax, when it came, was not a gentle release, but a violent, shuddering explosion that left us both momentarily blind, our bodies trembling in the aftermath. For a few seconds, we lay there, tangled together on the sofa, the afternoon sun warming our slick skin. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged, desperate breaths. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint, familiar rumble of Clara's car engine as it turned onto our street. Panic, cold, and absolute, replaced the heat of passion. We scrambled apart, a frantic, clumsy ballet of pulling on clothes and smoothing down hair. I looked at Amelia. Her face was flushed, her lips swollen, her eyes wide with the same panicked adrenaline that was coursing through my veins. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. We were partners now, bound not by love, but by the shared, ugly weight of our secret. Just as I tucked in my shirt, the key turned in the lock. The front door swung open, and Clara walked in, smiling, holding a small grocery bag. "They were out of the 2%, she said cheerfully, so I got the skim. "What have you two been up to?" We were standing on opposite sides of the room, looking like guilty children, our hearts still pounding from a completely different kind of exertion. I forced a smile, the muscles in my face feeling stiff and unnatural. "Nothing," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm. "Just talking." That single, frantic encounter on the living room sofa was the point of no return. It was not an end, but a beginning. The affair, which had started as a strange, dreamlike transgression, now solidified into a grim reality, a secret, second life that ran in the shadowy spaces of our days. We became experts in the art of deception, fluent in a silent language of stolen glances and subtle gestures. A slight nod of my head as I left for a fabricated errand to the hardware store. A lingering touch of her fingers on a coffee cup left on the counter. These were our secret communications. Our plans laid in plain sight of the one person we were betraying. Our home, once a sanctuary of shared love and comfort, was transformed into a stage. Clara was the unknowing audience, and Amelia and I were the lead actors in a sordid play, performing our roles with a desperate, nerve-shredding precision. The psychological toll of this new life was immediate and catastrophic, a slow, methodical dismantling of the man I thought I was. My entire nervous system felt rewired, perpetually humming with a low-grade, anxious electricity. Every sound became a potential threat. The crunch of tires on the driveway was no longer my wife coming home. It was the possibility of being caught. The ringing of the telephone was not a friend calling. It was an unknown variable, a potential complication to our carefully constructed web of lies. I became a digital ghost, meticulously erasing call logs, text messages, and browser histories, scrubbing away the electronic footprints of my betrayal with the obsessive focus of a forensic expert. My own home felt alien, a hostile territory where I was constantly under surveillance, even if the only warden was my own guilty conscience. My personality began to fracture under the strain. With Clara, I was a chaotic mess of extremes. One moment, I would be distant and irritable, snapping at her over a trivial question about the bills because my mind was a million miles away, replaying a stolen kiss with Amelia in the pantry. I would see the hurt and confusion in her eyes, and a wave of suffocating guilt would wash over me. Then, I would overcompensate, becoming a parody of a loving husband. I'd smother her with affection, bringing her flowers for no reason, holding her in hugs that lasted a little too long, whispering "I love you" with a desperate, hollow intensity. This emotional whiplash was creating a chasm between us far more effectively than any argument could have. She was pulling away from my erratic behavior, a confused and hurt expression becoming her default look in my presence, even as I was desperately, clumsily trying to prove a love that I was actively murdering in secret. My entire perception of reality began to warp. The life I had with Clara, my work, our shared meals, our conversations about the future, began to feel like a tedious, black and white film I was forced to watch. It was the gray, obligatory stuff of life. The only moments that felt real, the only times the world bloomed into vibrant, shocking color, were the stolen moments with Amelia. A frantic, whispered 5 minutes in the garage while Clara was in the shower, a long, deep, silent kiss in the hallway when she had stepped out to get the mail. Those high-stakes, heart-pounding encounters became the focal point of my existence. My real life was not with my wife. My real life was the affair. Everything else was just the waiting. Love, I discovered, is a far more fragile thing than I ever imagined. It cannot survive in an environment of constant comparison, and I was comparing them relentlessly. Every gentle touch from Clara was weighed against the memory of Amelia's fiery passion. Every quiet, comfortable conversation with my wife felt dull, next to the memory of the deep, soul-bearing talks I'd had with her sister. And in the twisted logic of the addict, I began to resent Clara for these differences. I began to quietly blame her for my infidelity. If only she were more spontaneous, more daring, more like her. I was dismantling my wife in my own mind, stripping her of all the qualities I once loved, her calm, her stability, her gentle kindness, and recasting them as flaws, as reasons that justified the unforgivable things I was doing. I was so consumed by my own decay that I almost didn't notice the changes in Amelia. The bold, carefree, slightly reckless woman who had arrived from New York seemed to be receding, like a tide going out, leaving behind someone quieter, more somber. The thrill and playful danger that had once danced in her eyes was being replaced by a deep, impenetrable sadness. I would catch it in unguarded moments. I saw her once, watching Clara laugh at something on television, and the look on Amelia's face was one of such profound, heartbreaking guilt that I had to look away. Another time, I found her standing by the window in the guest room, just staring out at the rain, and she looked utterly lost, a ghost haunting a life that wasn't hers. I didn't understand the depth of it, and in my selfishness, I chose to interpret her melancholy as a sign of her growing, complicated feelings for me. I told myself it was because she was falling in love and was tormented by the impossibility of our situation. It was a comforting lie, one that fed my ego and absolved me of seeing the true extent of the damage I was causing to everyone, including her. My desire had long since metastasized from a simple, physical lust into a full-blown obsession. She was the first thing I thought of when I woke up and the last image in my mind before I fell into a restless, dream-filled sleep. At my office, I would sit at my drafting table, surrounded by the clean, logical lines of my profession, and find that I had spent the last hour not working, but sketching the curve of her eye, the shape of her lips, over and over again on a piece of tracing paper. She was a fever in my blood, a constant, nagging ache that nothing could soothe except the next stolen touch, the next hurried kiss. The affair was no longer a thrilling escape. It had become my prison. I had built it myself, brick by brick, lie by lie, and now I was trapped inside its walls, slowly suffocating alongside the very people I was claiming to love. An affair, I learned, is a creature that thrives on adrenaline and risk, but it cannot survive the harsh, sterilizing light of scrutiny. For weeks, Amelia and I had been living on the edge, and we had grown comfortable there. We had become arrogant in our deception, our secret language of glances and gestures becoming a source of shared private pride. Our stolen moments were our religion, our secret rituals performed in the quiet corners of the house. We thought we were untouchable, that our careful planning and the sheer audacity of our actions had made us invisible. We were fools. We had forgotten that the foundation of our entire illicit world was built on the one thing we were systematically destroying, Clara's trust. We had forgotten how fragile that foundation truly was. The unraveling began, as it so often does in this modern age, with a cell phone. It happened late on a Tuesday night. Clara was downstairs in the living room, curled up on the sofa under a blanket, reading a novel. She'd had a long day at the library, and I assumed she'd be asleep within the hour. I was upstairs in my office, trying to work, but the attempt was pathetic. My mind was not on floor plans or structural supports. It was on Amelia, who had gone to her room shortly after dinner. The obsession had become a physical ache, a constant gnawing hunger. Giving into a moment of reckless, stupid weakness, I pulled out my phone. I texted her, the words appearing on the screen under the harsh glow of my desk lamp, a testament to my complete loss of control. Can't stop thinking about this afternoon in the kitchen. I need you. I hit send without a second thought, the message disappearing into the ether, a digital arrow shot into the heart of my own life. A few moments passed. Then, from downstairs, I heard it. A sound both mundane and, in that instant, more terrifying than a gunshot. The sharp, distinct buzz of a phone vibrating against a wooden surface. My blood ran cold. Amelia's phone. It was supposed to be in her room, safely out of sight. A cold dread washed over me as I heard Clara's voice, calm and gentle, call up the stairs. "Amelia, honey, you left your phone down here on the end table. It just went off." Panic, pure, absolute, and suffocating. My mind raced, playing out a dozen catastrophic scenarios in a split second. Clara, picking up the phone to bring it to her sister. The screen lighting up. My name, my words, the world ending. I shot out of my chair, my own phone clattering to the floor, and moved out of the office with a speed and silence I didn't know I possessed. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down. The scene below was a tableau of my own personal hell. There was Clara, looking up towards the second floor, a slightly puzzled expression on her face. And there, on the small table, right next to her elbow, was the phone. As I watched, frozen in horror, she began to reach for it, a casual, helpful gesture that was about to detonate our entire world. "I'll get it," the words burst from my lungs, too loud, too sharp. I clattered down the stairs, trying to arrange my features into something resembling normalcy. Clara looked at me, her hand hovering over the phone, her head tilted. "What's the rush?" she asked, a small frown line appearing between her eyebrows. I didn't answer, my focus entirely on the small electronic bomb on the table. I snatched it up, my hand trembling. As I did, the screen lit up and I saw my own message, a glowing white beacon of my stupidity, stark against the black screen. I angled the phone away from her, my body shielding it as if protecting it from a blast. My thumb moved frantically over the screen, swiping, deleting, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure she could hear it. "Ethan, what on earth is wrong with you?" Clara's voice was no longer just curious. It was laced with an edge of sharp suspicion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked up at her, my face slick with a cold sweat. I opened my mouth to form a lie, any lie, but my mind was a blank wall of white noise. At that precise moment, Amelia appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her eyes darting between my panicked face and Clara's narrowing gaze. "It's your phone," Clara said, her eyes never leaving mine. "You got a text. Your husband seems to think it's a matter of national security." The sarcasm in her voice was a new and terrifying weapon. The three of us stood there, frozen in a triangle of accusation, guilt, and dawning horror. The illusion of our happy, complicated little family had just shattered. Amelia began to descend the stairs, her face a mask of carefully constructed nonchalance, but I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. I had to say something. I had to build a wall of words around the truth. "It was a notification," I stammered, handing the phone to Amelia. "Looked like it was from your old landlord in New York, the one who was harassing you. I didn't want it to upset you." The lie was flimsy, pathetic, but it was all I had. I watched Amelia, praying she would understand, that she would pick up the thread of this desperate, fraying narrative. She took the phone, her eyes briefly meeting mine. In that split second, she understood everything. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to one of perfect, practiced annoyance. "Oh, that lunatic," she sighed, shaking her head as she scrolled through a screen that was now blank. "I swear I'm going to get a restraining order. Thank you, Ethan. You're sweet to worry." She was magnificent. Her performance was flawless. But we had forgotten one thing. We were performing for an audience that knew us better than anyone else in the world. Clara didn't buy it. She didn't have the proof. She hadn't seen the words, but she had seen something far more incriminating. My terror. She looked at me, her loving husband, and at her sister, her closest relative, and for the very first time, she did not see family. She saw two co-conspirators. Her expression, which had been confused and suspicious, hardened into something else, something cold and sharp and utterly devastating. It was the look of a woman whose deepest trust had just been fractured. She didn't say another word. She simply picked up her book, turned off the living room lamp, and walked past both of us up the stairs, leaving us standing in the sudden darkness. The thrill of the affair, the intoxicating drug of the risk, it all evaporated in that moment, replaced by the cold, sickening dread of the consequences. The game was over. We had played, and we had almost lost everything. Amelia and I stood in the dark for a long time, the silence between us filled with the ghost of the life we had just nearly destroyed. The affair was no longer an escape, a pocket of vibrant, dangerous life. It was a bomb that we had built together, and we had just learned how terrifyingly sensitive its trigger really was. We now knew that it was no longer a question of if it would detonate, but when. The aftermath of the close call was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, creeping ice age. The warmth vanished from our home, replaced by a biting Arctic cold. Clara never confronted me. She never accused Amelia. She did something far worse. She withdrew. She became a ghost in her own house, a polite, distant stranger who just happened to share our address. Her conversations with me were clipped, functional, limited to the logistics of our shared life. Did you take out the trash? I'll be home late from work tonight. The easy intimacy, the shared jokes, the casual touches, all of it was gone, and in its place was a watchful, wounded silence. Her eyes, which once looked at me with unconditional love, now held a permanent, guarded suspicion. She would look from my face to Amelia's, and back again, and in her gaze, I could see her trying to piece together the ugly puzzle she didn't want to solve. This new reality, this Cold War fought in the trenches of our own hallways, was infinitely more unbearable than an open conflict. The affair, which had thrived in the heat of secrecy and risk, could not survive in this frozen tundra of suspicion. The stolen glances between Amelia and me were no longer filled with lust, but with a shared, panicked guilt. We were prisoners of the atmosphere we had created, and it was suffocating us. The thrilling, vibrant escape had become a claustrophobic cage. We were both waiting for the axe to fall, and the waiting was a torture unto itself. It was Amelia who finally broke. 3 days after the incident with the phone, we were all sitting at the dinner table, the silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. The only sound was the scrape of cutlery on porcelain. Amelia put her fork down, the small noise making both Clara and me jump. She cleared her throat, her eyes fixed on her plate. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My friend in San Francisco has an extra room, and there's a great job opportunity there that I want to check out. I think it's time for me to go." She finally lifted her head and directed a fragile smile at Clara. "I booked a flight for Saturday." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, hollowing sensation in my stomach. Leave? The concept was so alien to the world I had built in my head that I couldn't process it. In my twisted, obsessive fantasy, she had become a permanent fixture, an integral part of my life. Her leaving was an outcome I had never allowed myself to consider. I looked at Clara, who simply nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "If you think that's what's best, Amelia," she said, her voice flat, "we'll miss you." The politeness was more brutal than any accusation. Later that night, I found Amelia in her room, the guest room. She had a suitcase open on the bed and was methodically folding clothes into it. The sight of it, the tangible proof of her imminent departure, sent a wave of pure, selfish panic through me. I closed the door behind me. "You can't," I said, my voice coming out as a choked whisper. "You can't just leave." She didn't look up from her packing. "I have to, Ethan." "You know I do." "No," I insisted, taking a step closer. "I don't know that. What about us?" The question sounded pathetic, even to my own ears. She finally stopped folding and looked at me, and for the first time since the night of the storm, I saw the raw, unguarded vulnerability in her face. The confident, seductive woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and broken. "Us?" she repeated, her voice laced with a bitter, incredulous irony. "What us, Ethan?" "This?" This ugly, secret thing we've been doing in the dark? This isn't a relationship. It's a sickness. Her words were a slap in the face, a dose of a reality I didn't want. It's not, I pleaded, my voice cracking. It's more than that. God, I think I'm falling in love with you. The confession hung in the air between us, ugly and desperate. I truly believed it in that moment. My obsession was so complete, I had mistaken it for love. We can make this work, I pushed on, my mind grasping at insane, impossible straws. We can be together. That was what finally broke her. Her face crumpled, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Make it work? She whispered, her voice trembling with a rage born of despair. How? Tell me how, Ethan. What's the plan? You leave your wife, the woman who has loved you and stood by you for years? You tell her you're leaving her for her own sister, for her twin? You want me to be the woman who does that? The woman who watches her other half shatter into a million pieces and know that I was the one holding the hammer? She was breathing heavily now, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and guilt. You want to build a life with me on the smoking ruins of hers? Do you have any idea how monstrous that is? It wouldn't be like that, I said weakly, but we both knew I was lying. It would be exactly like that. She shot back, her voice rising. You are so lost in this fantasy, that you can't even see the real people you are destroying. You think this has been a game for me. Every single morning, I have to look my sister in the eye, knowing what we've done. I see the trust dying in her eyes, and it feels like a part of my own soul is dying with it. And every time I look at you, she stopped, choking on the words, unable or unwilling to finish. She shook her head, a look of profound self-loathing on her face. This was a mistake. From the very beginning. I was lonely and broken, and you were there. And we lit a match in a house made of gasoline, and now we are surprised that it's burning down. She turned her back on me then, resuming her packing with shaking hands, a clear and final dismissal. The fantasy died in that room. It was murdered by the brutal, undeniable truth of her words. All the heat, the passion, the intoxicating thrill, it was all gone, replaced by the cold, sordid reality of our actions. This was not a great, tragic love story. It was a cheap, ugly betrayal, and we were the villains. I was left standing in the doorway, a ghost in my own home, watching the woman I thought I loved pack a suitcase to escape the wreckage I had created. The affair was over. The only thing left was to wait for the silence she would leave behind and to face the woman whose life I had just finished destroying. The Saturday of her departure arrived with a cruel, indifferent brightness. The three of us stood at the front door in a triangle of excruciating, unspoken truths. The air was thick with things that could never be said, with apologies that could never be offered, and forgiveness that could never be granted. Clara and Amelia hugged, a stiff, formal embrace between two halves of a whole that had been violently fractured. I watched, a silent spectator to the devastation I had engineered. Amelia pulled back, and her eyes met mine for a final, fleeting moment. There was no longing in her gaze, no secret message of a love that could have been. There was only a deep, bottomless exhaustion and a sliver of something that looked like pity. Then she turned, walked to the waiting taxi without looking back, and was gone. The closing of the car door was a sound of absolute finality, the sound of a book slamming shut in the middle of a chapter. Clara and I were left standing in the sudden, deafening silence of the house. For weeks, the silence had been a weapon, a tense, watchful thing. Now, it was simply a void. The energy, both good and bad, that had crackled in the air was gone. Amelia's absence was a physical presence, a ghost that occupied every empty chair and silent corner. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried. God, how I tried. I tried to be the husband I was before she came, the man Clara had married. I suggested date nights to restaurants we used to love. I brought home her favorite wine. I initiated conversations about her work, about our future, about anything at all that might rebuild the bridge I had burned between us. I was a frantic, inept repairman, trying to patch a shattered foundation with hollow words and meaningless gestures. Clara, in her infinite, heartbreaking grace, allowed me to try. She went along with the dinners, she smiled at my jokes, she talked about her day, but the light in her eyes was gone. The easy, unshakable trust she once had in me, in us, had been extinguished, and in its place was a permanent, guarded sadness. She was kind, she was polite, but she was no longer present. She was a ghost living alongside me, her heart safely locked away in a place I could no longer reach. Our marriage continued, but it was a marriage in name only, a polite arrangement between two people who shared a mortgage and a profound, unspoken sorrow. I was haunted not just by guilt, but by memory. The house was a museum of my transgressions. I'd look at the armchair by the window and see Amelia curled up with a book. I'd stand in the kitchen and remember the frantic, desperate heat of her kiss. I'd walk past the living room sofa and my body would remember the weight and warmth of hers. She was everywhere and nowhere, a constant, taunting reminder of the vibrant, destructive fire I had invited into our quiet life, a fire that had burned everything to the ground and left me alone in the ashes. The true nature of my punishment, my life sentence, was revealed to me months later. Things had settled into our new, sad normal. The Cold War was over, replaced by a quiet, indefinite truce. One night, in the darkness of our bedroom, Clara and I were intimate. It was a quiet, almost mechanical act, a gesture of remembered affection rather than present passion. In a moment of pure, desperate loneliness, I tried to summon the ghost one last time. I closed my eyes, and I tried to conjure Amelia. I searched my mind for the electric thrill of her touch, the unrestrained sound of her pleasure, the intoxicating danger in her eyes. But the memory, which had once been so sharp and vivid, was now a faded photograph. The edges were blurred, the colors washed out. The fantasy, the potent drug that had sustained and destroyed me, had lost its power. It was just an echo, a hollow, meaningless thing. Defeated, I opened my eyes, and I saw my wife. It was Clara, her face just inches from mine in the dim light. Only Clara, and her eyes were open too. She was looking at me, and her expression was one of such calm, devastating clarity that it stopped my heart. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred. There was only a profound, soul-deep recognition. She knew. She didn't know the details. She didn't know the who or the when, but she knew the fundamental truth. She knew that when I was with her, my heart, my soul, my mind, they were all somewhere else. She knew that she was not, and would never again be, enough. In that single, silent look, I finally understood. My punishment wasn't going to be a dramatic confrontation or a messy divorce. My punishment was this. It was waking up every morning for the rest of my life next to this good, kind woman and seeing the knowledge of my betrayal reflected in her sad, gentle eyes. I never confessed. She never asked. To leave would have been a mercy, an escape. I was condemned to stay. We lived together still, in our quiet, beautiful home, two ghosts bound by vows that have long since turned to dust. I did not just have an affair with my wife's twin sister. I conducted a fatal experiment. I was given a choice between the steady, warm glow of a love I had built and the brilliant, destructive flash of a desire I had never known. And the ultimate tragedy, the truth that will haunt me until my dying day, is the one I can never speak aloud, the one that is the title of my own private, silent hell. I liked it more, and that simple, terrible fact has cost me everything.